Edifice of Trust podcast. The Edifice of Trust podcast is a thoughtful discussion of today's current events from the perspective of America's founding principles. Welcome from heart-pumping music to head-thumping commentary. President Trump hated the original North American Free Trade Agreement, so-called NAFTA, so much that he refused to call his new North American Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico a new NAFTA. So he called it the U.S., Mexico, and Canada Agreement, with the acronym of USMCA, an unpronounceable and unremarkable set of letters. He couldn't call it the USMC trade agreement because the Marine Corps, unlike other militaries around the world, does not engage in commerce. So new NAFTA it is. For all the Sturm und Drang on the Twitterverse from the president, most people will view the new NAFTA much like the old NAFTA. There are enough changes in the new NAFTA for President Trump to claim a tremendous victory. But in truth, much of the boilerplate of the agreement will be the same, and the digital technologies and intellectual property clauses in the new NAFTA were actually lifted from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, that President Trump dropped out of. The new NAFTA provides that the North American content for motor vehicles increases from 62.5% to 75%, which will require manufacturers to seek new sources of supply for some parts. In addition, 40% of the workers on the North American vehicles must make over $16 an hour, a move that might help American workers or might be a big bonanza for Mexican workers. But putting a fixed minimum wage seems a bit odd. I mean, in 10 years, when McDonald's workers are all getting $15 an hour, as they are currently demanding, $16 an hour auto worker wage won't seem so great. They did put in a sunset clause that would terminate the agreement in 16 years, but the agreement also includes a 6-year review to renew and update the agreement, at which time the pact could be extended for another 16 years ad infinitum. While some of the provisions of the new NAFTA are pathetic attempts to bring back the U.S. manufacturing industry of the mid-20th century from the dead, other provisions have a more sinister impact. The Trump administration wanted to eliminate the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS system, where companies can challenge foreign governments if that country enacts a policy that violates the terms of the trade agreement. Mr. Trump and his advisors don't like these clauses and believe that they infringe on U.S. sovereignty and encourage companies to offshore production. But these clauses are essential when conducting international business. While working as an international banker, my banks always required any loan agreement or bond indenture to be subject to the U.S. or U.K. legal jurisdiction, meaning that if the borrower broke the terms of the agreement, we could sue in the United States or U.K. The reason for this was that the rule of law was very weak in many foreign countries, and a legal dispute was very likely to be decided based on national interest instead of the merits of the case. For example, while I was in Mexico, a friend of mine had his business stolen from him by his well-connected Mexican partner, and he couldn't get any justice in the Mexican court system. In fact, he got thrown into jail for a while. The rule of law has made great strides around the world since I was drafting those documents 30-plus years ago. Many countries now require domestic law jurisdiction for these international transactions. The investor-state dispute settlements protect investors in case the rule of law tide around the world begins to ebb. In the new NAFTA, investor-state dispute resolution clauses illogically and arbitrarily apply to some industries and not to others. But President Trump wants the ability to use the sovereign power at his disposal to shape American industry as he sees fit. Even worse, While Chinese industrial policy is focused on creating new technologies such as artificial intelligence and 5G networks employing highly skilled workers, President Trump's industrial policy is attempting to recreate mid-20th century manufacturing industries employing lower-skilled blue-collar workers. President Trump's actions put him in the same bucket as far-left progressives by focusing on, quote, whatever works solutions in order to achieve preordained outcomes rather than resolving the underlying problems that cause the unwanted outcomes. These whatever works solutions undermine the rule of law and concentrate even more power in the hands of the executive branch. So the new NAFTA is a retreat from the intent of promoting free trade that has been the hallmark of U.S. trade policy for decades, although, thankfully, not the full-fledged destruction of our trade relationships that had been threatened. And we should also be thankful that the required discussions on renewing new NAFTA in 6 years will begin after President Trump has left the White House. Maybe then we can begin to focus on authoritarian mercantilist regimes that try to weaken and evade the rules of international free trade instead of on our friends and allies. I will be right back after this brief announcement. Don't forget, my latest book, 2017, A Trumpian Year in Review, is now available in paperback and ebook versions on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iBooks. Also available are my previous publications, Principled Policy and Edifice of Trust. And if you want some adventure, try my novel, Tawantin Suyu. More information on these books, plus links to retail outlets, is available on my website, www.edificeoftrust.com. Thank you. Welcome back. I have to admit that trade agreements are not perfect, but trade agreements are better than no agreement. Our biggest trade problems are not with our trade agreement partners, but with countries and groups with whom we do not have such agreements. China, Japan, and Europe, those are our biggest trade deficits. China, it's $367 billion in 2015. In the same year, Japan was $69 billion, and Europe was $156 billion. That's 78% of our total trade deficit. I would like to quote to you from my 2017 book, The Edifice of Trust. From the book, Mr. Trump claims that NAFTA is a disaster. In 1993, just as President Bill Clinton was signing NAFTA, the U.S. had a trade surplus with Mexico of $1.7 billion. In 2015, the trade deficit was $60.7 billion. To Mr. Trump, that is losing big time. But in the 22 years since NAFTA was signed, U.S. exports to Mexico have increased 5.6 times, from $41.9 billion to $235.7 billion. Discounting for inflation, trading goods increased 3.4 times. This is much faster than the overall economy. In addition, the U.S. export of services has increased 193%, and we have a surplus of $9 billion in services. Some people might say that was winning big time. It is true that Mexican exports to us increased even more, from $39.9 billion to $296.4 billion, thus the larger trade deficit. That increase in trade created many new jobs in Mexico, some of which were lost by people in the U.S. But U.S. exports also created new jobs, many more than were lost to Mexico. That is the nature of international trade. It benefits both countries. It is also true that Mexico benefited more than the U.S., but Mexico was a poor country, and those exports had a big impact on their economy. In 2015, U.S. exports to Mexico represented 1.3% of our economic output. In Mexico, their exports to us represented 25.9% of their output. So while Mr. Trump might consider gaining modestly compared to gaining enormously as losing, I consider it a win-win situation. Thank you for listening. Thanks for listening to my podcast. If you would like to hear more Edifice of Trust podcasts, please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.